So he's retreated. And this act of retreat is going to make sense as we gain more of a window into his past as the story progresses, particularly his friendship with a woman called Lorna, one of the other main characters, who was a friend of his at art school in London in the 1990s and then became his dealer. But then that friendship began to wane, partly because Thomas became infatuated with an older man, and that's an important part of his backstory.
Today on Rainbow Country, the Violet Hour.
Hi, I'm Christopher Rice, and this is Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
James Cahill, hello. Hi, how are you?
Hi, Mark. Very well. Great to be here.
I have to say thank you for being here to have your voice, your story be heard by the LGBT community and beyond. So thank you for this. I appreciate it. You are a novelist. You are an art critic, an art historian. The Violet Hour. This is your current book, a novel. Talk to me about this book, this novel, and essentially what are within the pages of The Violet Hour. Talk to me about the story.
Well, The Violet Hour is my second novel, and it really is the story of three people, three very different people, each of them in the contemporary art world. Now, this is a world I worked in for a long time. I'm very familiar with it, a world of sort of big sales, big parties, big egos. You don't need to know a huge amount or anything really about the art world. It's the setting of this novel, but really it's a story about loss, about longing, about betrayal, about the past versions of ourselves that we cling to. So, as I say, there are three main characters, and the main one of all of them is an artist in his mid-40s called Thomas Haller, who is a globally successful abstract painter. Think sort of Andy Warhol or Jeff Koons, this big superstar name in contemporary art, who, at the very beginning of the story, mysteriously has left the New York art world. He's left it behind. He's seemingly run away from everything that had defined him, and he's gone to live in a wasteland. At least he thinks of it as that. It's the mountains above Lake Geneva in Switzerland. He's built his own house, so he's retreated. And this act of retreat is going to make sense as we gain more of a window into his past as the story progresses, particularly his friendship with a woman called Lorna, one of the other main characters, who was a friend of his at art school in London in the 1990s and then became his dealer. But then that friendship began to wane, partly because Thomas became infatuated with an older man, and that's an important part of his backstory. The third main character is a real estate tycoon in New York called Leo Goffman in his 80s, who's a very different character again, kind of a monster in a way, this mean, egocentric guy who spends his days surrounded by his art treasures at the top of this penthouse in Manhattan. Um, and really, as I said before, it's the story of how each of them is dealing with their past and their present and looking back at their lives and figuring out what they've become. It's very much a story about retrospection, which I guess is partly why it has the title it does.
So you just mentioned it. You worked in a contemporary art gallery in London, England for, I believe, over a decade. Did your time there help, whether it was conscious or unconsciously, did it help to inform the writing of The Violet Hour?
I guess it did, although nothing fed in that directly. I'm certainly not, this is not a sort of thinly fictionalized version of my real life in the art world. Everything in terms of the characters and even the plot is pretty much invented. So things fed in gradually and indirectly. And actually, when I was working um, in the gallery, I was thinking more about my first novel, actually, which is it's also about art, but it's a different sort of story. It's about an art historian, an academic in the 1990s in Cambridge University, and this man who then goes to London in the mid 90s and has a midlife sexual awakening. Um, but certainly all of those years I spent in the contemporary art world, meeting different kinds of artists, seeing different sorts of work, encountering a whole variety of people, including collectors and curators and gallerists. Um, of course, that has provided a lot of the sort of mood and material for the Violet Hour. It's very much immersed in that world, and I guess it seeks to be a portrait of that world. I didn't want it to be satirical. I think it's actually quite a hard world to satirize. So really what I've endeavored to do is to create a realist portrait of that whole international contemporary arts sphere.
This novel, at the heart of it, have queer characters. Why was it important for you to have this contemporary art story, the setting, at the heart of it, have queer characters, characters that are part of the LGBT community? Why was that important for you?
Well, they do say write about what you know, and it reflects my own experience, my own life most closely of all. I mean, there are non-queer characters in the book as well, specifically Leo Goffman, the real estate billionaire who is a widower, but he's very haunted by the loss of his wife some 20 years earlier. But certainly, yes, the other two main characters, Thomas the painter and Lorna, his old friend, his former dealer, this British woman in her 40s, who in a way is my favorite character. She's the conscience of the novel, I think. They are both gay, and a number of the secondary characters are. And the art world is, like anywhere, is full of queer people. But it's about personal experience. It's also, I suppose, about thinking about the myriad variety of gay or queer lives, the fact that they really do not conform to any given type at all, not just between, gay men and lesbian women, but in the fact that all of these individuals really is an individual with very specific, singular experience. That was something I was quite keen to reflect. And in terms of the storyline as well, I'm not so interested um, in conforming to certain sort of tropes or types, providing redemptive arcs where we might feel that they're needed. I want these queer characters to be as real as people are in the real world.
The title, The Violet Hour. I almost want to say The Violent Hour, but The Violet Hour. Is there a story behind choosing this particular title?
I guess there is. I was going to say there's a fair amount of violence as well as eroticism and all sorts of things in the story. I mentioned before how it's a story in many ways about retrospection, about people sort of trying to square their past and present lives. And Violet Hour, of course, has this resonance of twilight, the end of the day. Certainly, Leo Goffman is in the twilight of his whole life and thinking about his life from the perspective of being very old. Specifically, the title came to me when I was writing the story, just because it was a line I remembered from T.S. Eliot's poem The Wasteland, where he talks about he's setting the scene for a particular episode, and he talks about at the violet hour. Um, and it's this sort of epically beautiful image of evening light, but it's somewhat ironic because actually in the poem, that particular episode is really kind of dismal and violent and unpleasant. It's about this young woman who returns from work and she's bored and she's tired, and then this ugly young man who she's been seeing comes round and more or less forces himself upon her. So it turns from this scene of a beautiful world and evening sky to something much more abrasively real and unpleasantly mundane. And I guess I was interested in writing this story in recreating those sorts of sudden jolting shifts in atmosphere. It's something I like in books and in films when you're not allowed to sort of get too comfortable in terms of the genre or the atmosphere, when the work itself switches pace or switches tempo, and defies your expectations in that way. But yeah, the title is most obviously a reference to T.S. Eliot's poem, but there is also a sort of echo, I guess, of Sunset Boulevard, the film, Sunset, Violet Hour. And Sunset Boulevard was an important influence as well in terms of the story, but also in terms of the kind of noirish cinematic atmosphere that I've tried to create at a number of points in this story.
So, James Cahill, you are a novelist, an art critic, an art historian. How does one become an art critic?
That's a very good question. I can't quite remember now. I guess it happened.
And why are you an art critic?
Well, why is anyone? This is a very important question. It's really hard to say, except that I would say I always loved writing and I always loved the visual arts. So in a way, it was a natural thing that I would write about art. Um, although originally, when I was at school and at university, I did literary degrees, but then I gravitated more towards art and art history, and I was interested at one point in maybe going to art school and going more down the practical route, but I stayed with art history, and I guess that being my whole grounding. I I then did pursue this career in the contemporary art world in a commercial gallery, but I always had this academic side as well, and I did pursue academic research, and that's something I continue to do. And out of that came a lot of reviewing and criticism and writing. I mean, art critic can sound a little bit grand and forbidding and maybe somewhat old-fashioned. I mean, it means all sorts of different things depending on who you're talking to and what kind of writing you're looking at. But really, for me, it's a way of engaging with art and thinking about it, plus making a living, I guess. But one thing I would say is that my role or my career as an art critic, although it's obviously informed this book in terms of the material and the content, it is quite a separate thing. There's a lot about art in the story, but I have not sought to sort of apply my art critical, art analytical mind to telling this story. I don't want I don't want it to feel like an art critic's novel. It needs to feel like a novel, a proper novel. Um, and to that extent, I guess I've tried to subdue my own opinions, my own beliefs about art and its purpose and all of that kind of thing.
So, in regards to yourself and talking about you personally, when you say you're an art critic, do you mean like paintings? Are you talking sculptures or both? Or
Everything really. I mean, my background was always in contemporary art, which itself is a slightly nebulous category. And in fact, one of the characters in The Violet Hour, when they're all in Venice at the Venice Biennale, which is the big contemporary art event of the calendar, one of my characters even sort of asks, "What do we mean by contemporary art?" Because some people will tell you it began in the 1960s. For some people, it just means work by living artists. It means slightly different things again, depending on who you ask. But that's however exactly you define it is my main field. So I write about anything within that, painting, sculpture, video, performance. Um, I do have certain interests, I suppose, that slightly guide or steer my taste or what I'm going to write about. Um, and I do also write about certain historical things. I've always been very interested in classical antiquity, by which I mean ancient Greek and Roman culture and literature. And I've thought for a long time about the relationship between ancient culture and contemporary art and the ways in which they connect with one another. Because actually, when you start looking, you realize that contemporary artists, people working today, painters, sculptors, are still very fascinated by very ancient stories or very ancient ideas about art and what it's supposed to do.
so, would you consider a banana duct taped to a wall contemporary art? Because that sold for $6 million back in
Yeah, he did very well out of
2024.
that piece. So look, the way I look at it is this. It's not even about whether I like it or not. I can have my own point of view about that. But, at least since the time of Marcel Duchamp, if an artist takes a real object like this book and puts it on a plinth or puts it in a gallery, or even if they just say, right, this is a work of art by me, then to some extent you just take that at face value and run with it. This is an idea that we've we've had since at least the 1950s or 1960s. Um, that something from the real world can be art if you choose to frame it that way or see it that way. I like to think of it in a weird way as a sort of really advanced form of or ultimate form of realism.
But a banana? I
Well,
mean,
in the sense,
come on, how long is that gonna last?
well, I know, and the idea there is that you'd have to, if you buy that thing, and look, if I had the money to buy it, I'm not sure it would be the first thing on my shopping list. But if you buy it, you just have to replace the banana every day probably and stick up a new one. But what I mean by ultimate form of realism is, for centuries people have painted bananas and painted them more and more exquisitely and realistically, and in a way, that banana taped to the wall answers to and extends this long tradition of realist art, of still life, of painting fruit, of depicting it. All that's happened is the artist has kind of leapt from a representational mode into an absolutely not even realist one, but a real one, whereby the object is the work of art. I mean, look, philosophers and art theorists have spilt a hell of a lot of ink trying to rationalize this, so I'm not going to attempt it now. But I would say that I keep a pretty open mind about what art is allowed to be. That's not the same thing as whether I like it or not, or whether I would personally buy it. As I say, I've got to admit the banana wouldn't be probably the thing for me, but I try not to be too judgmental or too gatekeeperish about what is allowed inside the category of art.
Okay, here's a partial quote. A partial quote, and it's from the New York Times, a partial quote. Quote, Cahill keeps us on edge. His writing is intensely visual. There is strange magic in this novel. Unquote. That's from the New York Times. Here's my last question for you, James, and it's simply this. What do you hope audiences come away with once they've read, once they've experienced The Violet Hour?
Gosh, that's a really hard question, Mark, because when I write, and even afterwards, I'm not really. I mean, I'm delighted for people to read the novel and take from it what they will, and I'm not really presupposing what their reactions will be. I try not to do that, actually. But I guess I hope that people will be surprised by what they find. As I said before, I like a narrative, a story that surprises you, that disrupts, however subtly, your expectations, your preconceptions, that challenges you just a little bit. And I hope it will do that in various ways, even if it's quite subtle. That's what I always appreciate in a novel or pretty much anything I read, something that turns out to be not quite what I would have expected in terms of its characters or its storyline or just its underlying ambience. So I suppose that would be my ultimate hope, that it surprises people in the best possible way. Um, I think it's one of the most important things fiction can do, to shake you, if only a little bit, out of your everyday point of view, your everyday mindset, your your set of views about people, the world, art, all of those things. I like it if a book can ever so slightly destabilize me. So I hope it will do that in a good way.
Well said, well said. James Cahill, well said, well done, well written. Thanks for your time. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks so much, Mark. Thank you.